Hello there, and welcome to the first part in this Python series where we are going to write actual Python code. At the moment, you should have Python installed and you should have access to a code editor. I will be using Visual Studio Code, but any code editor is fine. Choose whatever you like. What we are going to learn in this video is how code is executed. We are going to cover math operations and displaying text, and finally, we are going to get basic user input. This is the screen that we finished on in the last video, where we have printed the word test, meaning if you're running the code again, we are getting the word test. That's a pretty good start, but not what I want to do for this video. Instead, I want to create a new Python file. This I do by going to the Explorer on the left side. If you can't see it, it's this symbol. Just click on it. And then right-click on this area and create a new file. This now needs a name, and I want to call it basics.py. Really important, you need the .py ending. Only because of that does Visual Studio Code know that we are working with a Python file. If you now press enter, we have a new Python file. On top of that, if you open the folder where we are working in, besides setup, we now also have basics.py. This is the file we just created. With that, I can go into full screen so we have fewer distractions. Now, just to test that this file is working, let me print, let's say, line 1. If I run the code again, which I can do either by going on this triangle, or in my case, I can use the custom hotkey Alt and A, that is doing the same thing. I set this one up in the last video. If we are doing that, we are getting the output line 1. And all of this is getting a bit messy. If you want to clean it up, you can go to these 3 dots and then clear terminal. That way things are a bit cleaner, and if you run it again, you get a bit less clutter. It's not ideal, but it's good enough. The thing we care about is line 1, so we know this Python code is working. Cool, that's a good sign. Which is bringing us to the first fundamental concept. Code in Python and basically any programming language is always executed from the top, meaning line 1, and then we are going down. For example, if we have more than one line, we have line 1, line 2, and line 3. We always start with line 1, then we execute the second print statement, and then we execute the third print statement. Which means if I run the code now, we can see line 1, line 2, and line 3 in this order. Later on, we are going to learn how to manipulate this order. For example, to create a loop where code runs forever, or the ability to only run code if a certain condition is true. But for now, we always run code from the start to the end, like you would read any book. I think that makes sense. Also, what you can do to organize your code a bit better is to add comments, which you do with the hashtag symbol. Anything after that will be ignored by Python. Let's call this one the execution order. You can also write a comment after a line of code. All you have to do is add the hashtag, and anything after that will be ignored. So this will be ignored. Super handy to add some annotations to certain lines of code or to entire blocks. Cool. With that, we have the first important concept. The next important concept would be data types, because in Python we have multiple. The one we have already seen, let me print it again, is simply words. So let's call it words. This could either be done with single quotation marks or with double quotation marks, meaning if I print double quotation mark words, we would get the same result. If I run the code again, we get words 2 times, one with single quotation marks and one with double quotation marks. Python doesn't really care, you just have to be consistent. Besides that, the other data type would be numbers. For example, we could print 1, 2, 3, we could print -10, or we could print 1.5. I can run all of this again, and we're getting words and then the numbers that we have just specified. These values are created via different data types. Words in Python are called strings, and those you create either with single or with double quotation marks. Both would be fine. Numbers can be integers or ints in short, and those could be either positive or negative. And if a number has a decimal point, it is called a floating point value or simply a float. Internally, Python is processing these numbers slightly differently compared to the integers, but that's not something you have to worry about. What you do have to worry about, however, are basic, let's call it operations. For example, what you could be doing is print, let's say 3 plus 3. Also, what you can do with comments is you can select all of this and then press Ctrl and the /. That way, you comment out all of the selected lines of code. If you press the same combination again, you uncomment them. In our case, we're going to print 3 plus 3. If I now run the code again, we're getting 6. And once again, let me clear the terminal so we can focus on what's happening here. We are just getting 6. The result of 3 plus 3. That should make sense. There are multiple math operations you can work with in Python. In my case, I want to duplicate this line, which you can do with Alt, Shift, and then the down arrow. That way you duplicate the line downwards. The basic math operations are plus, minus, multiply, and divide. If I now run all of this, we get 6, 0, 9, and 1.0, the respective results of these 4 operations. Notice here that whenever you divide a value in Python, the result will be a floating point value, which is interesting, but not something you have to be concerned about, because you can add these values up totally fine. For example, we could do 10 plus 0. Some longer floating point value. If I now add them together, we get the expected result. So integers and floating point values can be added together perfectly fine. What cannot be added together would be integers or floating point values and strings. And this should make sense. Imagine somebody asks you to add together 10 and the word hello. You wouldn't have any idea what to do with that, and Python is in the same spot. If I try to run the code, we are getting an error message that we have a type error, unsupported operand type for plus, int, and string. Python just doesn't know what to do with this operation, and for good reason. It doesn't make any sense. What you could be doing, however, is 10 multiplied with hello, and the result of that is going to be the string hello 10 times. This isn't something you usually do, but in very rare circumstances, this can be useful. What I want you guys to focus on is that sometimes you can add different data types together very easily, like integers and floating point values, but other times this is not possible. For example, multiplying an integer with a string is a bit weird but doable, but you can't add them together. There aren't really that many rules. Most of the time, the expected result is what you would be getting. Speaking of which, there's one more thing I want to cover, and that is the order of operation. Let's say we have an operation like 13 minus 3 times 4 plus 2. What do you think the result is going to be from all of this? Well, let's run the code, and the result is going to be 3. The correct order of operation is that you always start with multiplication, meaning 3 times 4 would be 12. After that, we can do 13 minus 12 plus 2, and that's quite easy. This would simply be 3. The result we have gotten down there. But sometimes you do want to be a bit more specific. For example, you might want this 4 plus 2 to be prioritized. For that, you can use parentheses and put them in there. If I now run this again, we are getting minus 5. We are getting this because we start with the parentheses operation. This would be 4 plus 2 or 6, which we are multiplying with 3. This would give us 18. And then the final calculation would be 13 minus 18, which is negative 5. Exactly what we have gotten down there. That should be reasonably straightforward. So next up, we can cover variables. And what variables allow you to do is to work over multiple lines. At the moment, we are always constrained to a single line of code. We can do this one, or this one, but we couldn't connect this line to this line, or this line to this line. For that, we always need a variable. And a variable is just a bucket where you can put a value into and take a value out, or change the value and do stuff like that. Let's say I want to create a variable called test, which you do by simply writing test. And then to assign it a value, you will need the equal sign. For example, in this case, I want to give it the value 1, 2, and 3. We have created a variable with the value 123. This we can then use. For example, we could print it, and if I run all of this again, we are getting 1, 2, and 3. To Python, this test is simply the value of 123, which means you could even use this in math operations, let's say +10, run all of this again, and we're getting 133. 123 plus 10. With that setup, you can connect multiple lines. For example, what you could be doing is tests is the same value, except we are adding 50 to it, and then we simply want to print the output, run all of this again, and we're getting 173. On line 23, we're creating a test variable with the value 123. On the next line, we got the same variable and assigned it a new value with this equal operator. After that, we got the value of the variable itself and then added 50. The result was 173. Now, this line isn't particularly elegant, and Python has a shortcut for that. What we can do is plus equal 50. That way we are taking the same variable and adding a value to it. So if I now run all of this again, we are still getting 173. Variables are incredibly useful, and we are going to use them all the time. Although, when using them, you do have to be careful because there are some limitations on the name you can use. Let's talk about that. When it comes to variable names, there are some parts that are mandatory. If you're not doing them, you are going to get an error message. Most importantly, you can only use the letters from A to Z, both lowercase and uppercase, the numbers 0 to 9, and the underscore symbol. These are the only characters that are allowed. Besides that, we cannot start with a number, meaning one test would be invalid, but test 1 would be fine. After that, variable names are case sensitive. So test 1 to 3 would be different from test 1 to 3 because the first one has a lowercase t, while the second one has an uppercase t. As far as Python is concerned, those are two entirely separate variables. Finally, the last limitation is that we cannot use the names of inbuilt functions. So for example, print couldn't be a variable name. That would be really confusing. After that, there are a couple of things that are beneficial, but not mandatory. The first one is that you should be clear with your variable names. For example, you could create a value that is called A and assign it a value of, let's say, 150. This A has no inherent meaning. If somebody else was to look at it, they would have no idea what you are trying to do. Also, when you are not looking at this code for half a year and come back to it, you will yourself have no idea what this A stands for. So you shouldn't use this kind of A at all. It should be something more descriptive. Depends on your use case, but you should rather have longer than shorter variable names. After that, you should also use what is called snake case. What this one means is that every character is always lowercase, and if you want to separate two words as one variable name, you are separating them with an underscore. Back in the code, this test we could call, for example, test value. And since this name changed, we have to change the name of all of the other test variables as well, so we stay consistent. If I now run this again, we get the same outcome. So test value is perfectly fine. Still not an amazing name for a variable, but it will do for now. What you couldn't be doing, however, is add a number at the beginning. That way, you immediately get a scary red color, so you can see this one isn't working. You also wouldn't be allowed to use other characters, like for example a pound sign. There you can see we get an error message right away. Also, what is not allowed to have a space between these values. There you can see right away we get lots of error messages, so let's not do that. Creating variable names will eventually become quite straightforward and you develop an intuition for it. For now, don't worry too much about it. As long as you don't get an error message, the variable name is going to be fine. Which means now we can come to the last part of this video, and that is getting input. And for all of that, I want to comment out the earlier parts so we can focus on one thing at a time. To get input, you will need a function that works kind of like the print statement. It is called input. This one, like print, wants to have a string that it is going to display. For example, we could write, please write something. If I now run the code, and let me clear the terminal once again, there we get, please write something with a square afterwards. And there we can actually type something. So word. And if I now press enter, we are finishing the code. So what happened? Well, when you are running this kind of command, Python is going to display the text and then check for user input, which in our case is working totally fine. The issue is we are not storing the value or do anything with it. For that, though, we can use a variable. For example, we could assign this value to a variable called user input. And then on the next line, we could print that user input. Also, what I want to do is to add a space after something, still inside of the quotation marks. What that is going to do, if I run the code again, we are still getting the same please write something. But now after that and the input square, we are getting one line of a separation. This is the space we have just created. Looks a bit cleaner, but isn't too important. What is much more important is that now we can write any kind of value. Let's say test. If I now press enter, we are printing test right afterwards. So basically what happened is that this input got the value of test. And this value was stored in the user input variable. And on the next line, we are printing that value, which is what we have gotten down there. With that, we can get some user input, and later on, we will learn how to manipulate this value, which is basically all that programming really is. Cool, with that, we can do an exercise, and then we are done with this basic part. What I want you guys to do is to create a greeter app. This will consist of two major parts. Number one, I want you guys to write the logic to ask the user for their name and then print something like hello, username, and have a nice day, or some kind of greeting. Now for that, you will have to figure out how to print multiple values on one line with a single print statement. At the moment, you do not know how to do that. For that, you will have to do some research. Look online, either in Google or in ChatGPT, to figure out how you can add multiple values into a print statement. Should be fairly straightforward. And throughout the series, I will make you do research quite often. It is a really important skill as a programmer that you have to learn early on. But anyway, pause the video now and see how far you get. Righty, back inside of the code. I want to comment out the user input bit we just did and instead add a comment for the exercise. First of all, we have to write an input statement where we are asking the user for the name. Let's say, what is your name with a question mark and a space afterwards, so we have a bit more spacing. If I run all of this now, we get what is your name, and we could write Bob. Although after that, nothing is going to happen. Simply because after this input, we're not doing anything with the return value. We could store this inside of a variable, let's call it user_name, and assign it a value. After that, we can print the username, and now if I run all of this again, we get what is your name again, let's write Bob, and we are getting Bob. So that is progress, but what I want to do is to write hello username, and then some kind of greeting like have a good day. How can we do that? And for that, we will need to do some research. What you would be looking for example, would be Python print multiple values, or something like that. The first result is Stack Overflow, which is a website where you can ask questions and usually get really good answers. But in our case, we don't really need that. Although, if you read the first line, you can just pass in values as parameters. So print value, comma, another value, and then another value. That's basically the answer. But in our case, I want to scroll down a bit. And there, for example, we get websites like Tutorials Point or Geeks for Geeks. Those are really good and very common. Let's have a look at Tutorials Point. In there, we're getting a couple of explanations of the basic function. And if you look a bit further down, all we have to do to print multiple values is to add them individually and then separate them by a comma. That's all we have to do. In fact, if you go down a bit further, you can see we can add even more stuff. But in our case, that's not too important. Which means back inside of our Python file, what we want to do is print something like hello as one string, then comma, and then another string with have a nice day, smiley face. If I now run the code, we get what is your name, let's say Bob again, and we get hello Bob, have a nice day. Also notice here, if you are separating these values by a comma, Python or the print statement is automatically adding one white space between the values, so you don't have to do it yourself. And well, with that, we have covered lots of basic parts of Python. For the next part, we are going to look at how to manipulate values. I'll see you there.